All right, I'm going to start talking, and eventually people work their way in. But yeah, we've got a limited number of weeks for me to cover this material, and so I have to get going here. Um, we are today still in John 13, and we started this last week. I don't know if we can finish John 13 today, but we're going to try. You'll recall that. No, I know. I understand. I see what's happening. Yeah, it's okay. That's fine. The topic of chapter 13 is the final Passover meal, and this is beginning John's record of the entire evening that will progress into his farewell discourse, followed by his prayer to the Father, followed by the trials, the betrayal and then the trials. So here we are in chapter 13. Last week, we looked at verses 1 through 17, and in those verses, Jesus taught an object lesson. He gave them an example very intentionally, and the point was that they needed to learn to serve one another. And the summary statement from Jesus would essentially be ready to deny yourself in the service of others. And that is what was expected of his disciples. And that was the message that he wanted to get across. Now, in the course of that, Peter also got into a bit of a mess with Jesus, as he's prone to do, and he's not done for the evening. We're going to see more throughout the evening. So, what we're going to see now in today's class is we're going to see verses 18 through 30. And we're going to see Jesus essentially dismiss the one who will betray him. And then in verses 31 through 38, we see the beginning of Jesus' farewell statements. And so that's where we're going to pick up today, is with the dismissal of the one who will betray him. Now, there's some background stuff that we need to get into our minds as we work our way into this topic. And the first thing I want you to notice is that the caption I've put on this slide is probably a little different from the caption in your Bible. My Bible, for example, says Jesus predicts his betrayal. And the emphasis that I want for us to look for here is the one that I've put on the slide, because it's intentionally different. And what we're going to see is that Jesus is in control of this situation. This is not something that's happening without his knowledge, without his understanding. This is something that Jesus sees, he knows, and he anticipates in advance. And he, in fact, he is the one who dismisses Judas to go ahead and do his business, do his dirty business. So, as we read this section, watch for his control of the situation, even as he drives the betrayer out of the room and he pushes him forward into his treacherous actions. But also then, with the dismissal of Judas, this allows for Jesus to be alone with his true disciples, with those who he calls his own. Okay? Next background consideration that I want you to identify for this particular sequence of events is think about the physical surroundings and the setup of the room. We talked last week a little bit about the fact that in Jewish society, seating charts, seating arrangements were important. We made a sort of a passing analogy to, what happens at a royal dinner or a presidential dinner, where there's a very specifically orchestrated seating arrangement. Well, the seating protocol in Jewish society was that would sit around or lie or recline around a low table. They would rest on their left elbow, so as most people are right-handed, that would leave their right hand free to feed themselves. So they would be lying essentially on their left side with this. Now, why is this significant? Well, first of all, the host, in this case Jesus, would occupy the most significant place. He would be the individual of honor. The disciple whom Jesus loved, according to our text, was located immediately to Jesus' right. And we can know that from verses 23 and 25. Verse 23 tells us that the disciple whom Jesus loved was reclining next to Jesus, so that puts him either on his left or his right. And in verse 25 it says he's in a position where he can lean back on Jesus and ask him a question. And so that meant he had to be on Jesus' right-hand side to lean back on Jesus. If he was on Jesus' left-hand side, if he laid back, he would lay on the next guy. He would recline against the next guy. So the disciple whom Jesus loved had to be immediately to Jesus' right. And this was the position of second importance in the room. Okay? Now, Peter is somehow close to them. Most likely he's either directly across the table or the next station down to the right. And why do you know that? Because when he goes to ask Jesus a question, he asks through the disciple whom Jesus loved. That doesn't make any sense if Peter seated on this side, because he'd have just directly asked Jesus. If he's seated on that side, he's going to ask Jesus through the disciple whom Jesus loved. Okay? So we can gather some of these hints about where things are located in the room. And then the last thing to notice about this, in all likelihood, Judas is seated immediately on Jesus' left, because Jesus shares his bread with him. Okay? And the others don't recognize this even as being abnormal, so it's not like Jesus passed it 3 or 4 stations down. The others didn't recognize it as abnormal, so he had to be in a position where he could do this relatively anonymously and wouldn't draw particular attention to it. So, let's see. Where did I get to? Go ahead, Lamar. Well, this tells us something, and it tells us that Judas was still held in high regard by his peers. They don't have a clue what's going on. Now, there have been some references to what Judas is planning, but that's only in the mind of Jesus, okay? And John explains this sort of retrospectively, but as far as the real time of this thing unfolding, Judas still has the full confidence of the group. Okay, and he's in the position, there's Jesus, and then there's the disciple whom Jesus loved, and then Judas. And that's sort of the hierarchy here. It's impressive, isn't it? So think about that, where Judas is standing in the group. The group has trusted him with the money, even though they shouldn't have, they later realize. He takes his seat in a place of significance, the third most important seat. Even when he leaves the dinner in verse 29, the others assume that he's going for a legitimate reason. He's going to either buy some supplies or he's going to make a donation to give alms to the poor. So they explain his leaving the room on that basis. They still don't realize the treachery even when Judas leaves. And it's not until later that they are able to actually identify his act of sabotage. Okay, the next piece of background information. What about the activities in the room and what's going on? A lot of the Passover celebration is scripted. It's played out. You do this, you say this person does this, that person does that, and it just kind of goes down the sequence. But yet, this is a whole evening together, so there's a lot of stuff going on in the room. There are a lot of conversations. People are talking about a lot of different things, and there's little intimate groups surrounding the table that they're talking about different stuff. And some of those comments and some of those conversations then can be pretty private. And so it might not be something that everybody knows or sees. It's based on who they're sitting next to. I mean, I've gotten to the point where if I'm in a group of more than 3 or 4 people, I can't hear who the 5th or 6th person is down the room. I can't make out what they're saying. So there's a lot of private conversations, except for the scripted parts of the Passover the meal. And so remember that. Remember that we're only seeing, when John gives us this picture of what's going on in the room, we're only seeing the skeleton. There's a lot of other stuff happening, a lot of stuff being said. And what that allows for is it allows for some of these things that John points out probably aren't realized by everybody. Some of these conversations between John, Peter, Jesus, and or Judas are probably only 2 or 3 people. There's only a 2 or 3 person audience for some of those. But John, of course, has a ringside seat, and he can bring it all to us. So he kind of sees and gets it all. And so do we. But those sitting around the table obviously didn't, because if you get down to that verse I was mentioning to you, verse 29, when Judas leaves, and their reaction shows that most of them had no clue what he was about to do. They thought he was going out for a legitimate purpose. Okay, so those are the things I want us to watch for as we now pick up and read 18 through 30. Here we go. I'm not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, Jesus says. But this is to fulfill the scripture, he who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me. I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. I tell you the truth, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit, and he testified, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. And Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, ask him which one he means. And leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? And Jesus answered, it's the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I've dipped it in the dish. Okay, notice this is very likely a very intimate group that's having this conversation. And then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. What you are about to do, do quickly, Jesus told him. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the feast or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. So you can see that some of this conversation had to be intimate. Not everybody's aware of it. There seems to be a small group who's aware of what's going on, but the larger group, most of them have no clue what has taken place here in Jesus both identifying his betrayer and then dismissing his betrayer. In verse 18, Jesus indicates that he does indeed know that the sabotage is being planned. And he speaks of his knowing those that I have chosen. Now, one of the questions that comes up is whether when he speaks of, in verse 18, when he speaks of those I have chosen, is he referring to Judas and including Judas or not? And the answer, I think, is probably yes. Because if you go back to chapter 6 and verse 70, Jesus replied, have I not chosen you, the 12, and yet one of you is a devil? So Jesus had chosen them all. Judas had determined his treachery. But when in 13 verse 18, when he says, I know those I have chosen, that includes Judas in all likelihood. Okay? But then Jesus cites this passage from Psalm 41:9. And this, if we take a look at the psalm, it brings a different kind of meaning to what Jesus says about them sharing their bread. Okay? Because when you read this, in this account, you think of them sharing their bread at this meal. But if we look at Psalm, I think you'll see something different. Look at what Psalm 41, verse 9 says. Psalm 41, verse 9 says, "Even my close friend, whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." And this is a little more than we're just sitting down to eat now, and we're sharing bread. We're sitting next to each other. The psalmist is speaking of a relationship that goes between these two and has extended and has been in place for some time. Notice what the psalmist says. He calls him my close friend. My close friend. This is the relationship we've had. He says, my close friend who I have trusted. I have given him my confidence. And then it says, he who shared my bread. And he who shared my bread means that they had eaten together and fellowshiped together for 3 years. This is not just about the night. Judas is not just breaking the relationship of an evening. He's breaking a relationship that had gone down deep for a long time. And this is the relationship that's being broken. And so it describes this, the psalm describes the relationship between Judas and Jesus in a remarkable way. Think about the hours they've spent together. Think about the dangers that they have survived together. Think about how they depend on one another. And now that whole thing is ending. That whole thing is breaking up. Okay. Verse 19. Jesus indicates that he realizes that they will all become aware of Judas's treachery. They aren't now, but they will become of it. They will become aware of it. What if Jesus doesn't warn them in advance that this is going to happen? What's that going to do to the other disciples who see it? They're going to get angry at Judas, okay? They're probably going to get angry at Judas no matter what. Buff? Yeah, they really wouldn't believe that Jesus was in control of that situation. You didn't see this coming, Judas? Or I'm sorry, Jesus? You didn't see this coming from this guy? He's your he's your left-hand man. He's one of your closest in our minds. What has gone on here? How did you miss this, Jesus? And so Jesus gives them a breadcrumb right here in advance so that when it occurs, they'll look back and they say, oh, Jesus knew this the whole time. So they will no longer question their faith, and instead it will be a point that builds their faith, right? And remember, that's where John's going in this whole record, is towards the building of faith. So Jesus just leaves this breadcrumb here because it's going to be a faith-enhancing piece of information down the road. Verse 20. Jesus encourages his disciples not to waver in their belief and their service to him because they have his and the Father's divine authorization for what they're doing. So don't waver. This is still the plan. It's still my plan. It's still the Father's plan, and you are part of it. And their acceptance of me will be tied to their acceptance of you. If they accept you, they'll be accepting me. If they refuse you, they'll be refusing me. And that's what he's saying in verse 20. I skipped a slide or two here. 18 through 20. 20. And then 21. Jesus is troubled. What are the reasons for Jesus' angst right now? Why is Jesus so troubled? It's hard to see your friend doing this to you, isn't it? Okay? But what else? The end's coming. His passion is about upon us. Yes? Their lack of faith, all good ideas. But remember, a couple chapters back we read about Jesus being troubled. Do you remember where that was? And it's the same word. It's the same Greek word. It was at the tomb of Lazarus. And as Jesus came to the tomb, he was troubled. And the thinking there is that it's the confrontation with Satan about the death that was taking place that was really what was going on here. And then we saw it again when in chapter 12, Jesus had his Gethsemane-type movement when he said, "What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour?" No. It's for this reason that I came to this hour. So he's going through this gut-wrenching exercise in his soul, and he's confronting Satan directly. And here we see it again. He's confronting Satan directly in this interaction and this interchange. And that's where this is. So all of the things that we've said are true, and that's part of where Jesus' angst is coming from. But above all of that is that this is the confrontation with the enemy. And that is what is in front of him right now. Oh, excuse me. Notice in verse 21 that John, as he records this, refers to this as the testimony of Jesus. He says, after he had said this in verse 21, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified. We've talked a lot about how John is using this gospel to build faith, and he's providing all these different witnesses to testify on the behalf of Jesus. And here is Jesus testifying for himself, and he's putting it on record in advance that this thing is going to take place, although he still hasn't revealed who it will be. This word that we see in I was thinking about this on the way over here this morning, this word that shows up in the caption on my Bible where it says Jesus predicts his betrayal. We have a tendency to overlook that word predict because we expect Jesus to tell the future. We just expect it of him. But Jesus does this over and over again. I was thinking about the actual word predict. Pre, of course, means before, and dict means establish what will be. Whether you're taking dictation, you're putting it down on record. This is what will be. And this is what's happening with predictions. And that every time Jesus says something like this, it's something that has to be confirmed, and yet it will be. Jesus is fully aware of not what's happened yesterday and today only. He's also aware of what's happening tomorrow and the next day and the next day and so on and so forth. Yep. So this ability of Jesus to testify to future events is really significant. In verses 22 through 25, the disciples react to what Jesus has told them. Verse 22 tells us they're puzzled, they're shocked, and they're disturbed. What in the world is this? And imagine the self-examination that must have triggered. Everybody around the room, the other Gospels tell us, they're saying, "Is it I, Lord? Is it I? Who is it?" And of course, Peter is the one who eventually asks the question in verses 23 through 25. What's that? Of course, Peter steps up again. Yep. Peter's always the pinch hitter. In verses 26 through 30, John identifies the scoundrel to us, his readers. But as the reader, in seeing this, gets more information than apparently existed around the table. So it's interesting that we're able to see more than Philip or Matthew or Thomas. We see more of the picture here than they did. But that's the point of why John is recording this. Okay. Verse 26, Jesus replies to Peter's question. Peter had asked, "Who is it?" And Jesus says, "Well, it's the one I will give my bread to." Now, they're sharing a meal, and likely they're sitting next to each other, so this is not that strange of a behavior for the others to observe. But he dips his bread, and he gives it to Jesus. To Judas, I'm sorry. Yeah, those names are too close to one another, and I realize I get them confused, so please correct me. Okay, but as we've mentioned before, by the time we get to verse 28, nobody else knows why Judas is leaving. So they have missed this because of either the seating arrangement or other conversation going around the table. They have missed it. And then Judas leaves, and he's still unsuspected by the others. Go ahead. You would think so, but they thought he had a purpose. I mean, they sort of defend him. They say, well, he's going off. Jesus must have asked him to go buy something for the feast, or, according to verse 28, to give something to the poor. And that was an important part of Passover. An important part of Passover was making a donation to give alms at the temple. And so that part of this was a very, maybe not even possibility, it was almost expected of what this company would do, is they would make a donation to the poor. So the others explain that away, okay, instead of taking it to heart for what it was. Excuse me. In verse 27, we see Jesus then dismissing Judas. And essentially what he says is, okay, you go ahead, do what you're planning to do, and do it now. That's really what this says. He doesn't leave him the option of not leaving. Jesus dismisses him. What you're going to do, get on with it. Wow. He needs for Judas to proceed so that his mission can go forward itself. Without Judas's step, that's an important step that needs to take place for the son to be identified to the authorities. And Judas is going to provide that link for him. But also, Jesus needs this time to be alone with his own and to move on into their final preparations. And so in verse 30, we see that Judas left immediately. Jerry? Yeah, the devil has already been working on Judas for sure, but at this point, the devil comes in to roost. This is the final step. For example, if you go back to verse 2, which is before this moment, it says the evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray Jesus. So the devil's been working on Judas for a long time, but at the point when Judas gets to this moment, when the sequence gets to this moment, Judas is fully in with the devil, and his treachery is set. It's set in stone. The die is cast. Okay? Go ahead, Lamar. Description. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that in about 10 minutes. It's very important. Lamar is pointing to the last phrase of this section. It was night. Okay? And think about that from a spiritual perspective. And boy, the lights go off. But we'll get there in a minute. Jesus left immediately. Judas left immediately. And here's my section, the final words. It was night. What is the significance of these words? Well, it's a time of spiritual darkness. This is the time Jesus has been talking about. You remember Jesus said, I am the light of the world. But in chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, we're going to take the time to read these. Think about how he talked about the fact that light is going to end. It's going to be extinguished, okay? 9, verses 4 and 5, Jesus said, as long as it's day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no man can work, and while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Then jump to chapter 11, verse 10. It is when a man walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. And then chapter 12, verse 35 and into 36. Jesus told them, you're going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you have the light before darkness overtakes you. The man who walks in the dark does not know where he's going. Put your trust in the light while you have it. He has told them over and over again that that darkness is coming when his light will be extinguished. Okay? And now John tells us that this is all happening. It is night, and that has important spiritual meaning. Does that help, Lamar? Good. Okay, let's get through one other consideration in this part of the record, and that is that a new character or a new identity has been introduced here. And he came up in verse 23, and that was the disciple whom John calls the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, what does this term imply? Jesus loved all his disciples. So what's he talking about when he identifies one that Jesus loved? Well, it likely points to a special personal relationship. He loved them all in a mission sense, and they all had an important part in the role of the kingdom as far as what they were doing and going to do for Jesus. But there's one that perhaps he had a tighter history with. They may have even been related to one another, but they certainly had a deeper friendship than the others. Why would John have identified this disciple as the one whom Jesus loved? Well, remember when John is writing this and the dangers of being labeled an associate of Jesus, you know? And so maybe he's just doing this to keep it anonymous. All right? But we're going to see this disciple show up again. He's going to show up at the cross. And we're going to see the disciple whom Jesus loved again. We're going to see this disciple show up at the tomb when we're going to read again about the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then in chapter 21, after the resurrection, we're going to see the disciple whom Jesus loved again. And in that section, he finally identifies the disciple whom Jesus loved. And we'll just go there and look at it. This is 21, verse 24. John writes, "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and wrote them down." And we know that his testimony is true. John says that the one who's writing these things, the author, is the one whom Jesus loved. And of course, we identify the author of this book as John the Apostle. And so that's how we can put all this together. But at least earlier in the book, when we read about it at the time of the betrayal, at the tomb, at the resurrection, and then even after the resurrection, we only see him referring to himself in code. Okay? And so, but he is identified ultimately as the author of the book. What's significant about this in chapter 13 now is that we see that John, as the author, has a ringside seat to what's going on around the table that night. And because he does, he's privy to the inner talking and the inner actions of those who are closest to Jesus at the moment. And while the others could not recognize Judas from the signs that were given to them or that they missed, John, in all likelihood, got it. In fact, the more I read this, the more I study it, the more I try to put it together with the synoptics, I sort of think that in all likelihood, John was probably the only one of those sitting around the table that saw the whole story develop and understood it from beginning to end. And so we are getting a piece of information. We are seeing this from John's eyes, which means that we know more than the others sitting around the table that evening. Go ahead, Jerry. Well, sure. Yeah. Jerry asks, was John selected to write the Revelation? And sure, you can read that in chapter 1 very clearly, that this was given, the vision came to John. Yeah. So he is very specifically directed in that regard. And so it's important for us to see what John saw that night, that not only was Judas going to betray Jesus, but Jesus is the one in control of the situation who actually sent Judas on his way to do his dirty deed. It's remarkable, isn't it? Okay, well, the evening is not over. In fact, the evening's just beginning. I'm debating if I've got enough time to move forward with this. I think I'm going to hold off I've got more than I can get to for the rest of this section. But let me ask you to do this. Chapters 14, 15, and 16 are coming. And they are deep and they're challenging. So I'm just going to ask you to start reading from where we are here in 1331. Read through chapter 16 or even chapter 17. And start getting this in your mind, because there's a lot that we're going to need to discuss as we work our way through this. This is where we get into some of the deep theology of the book, and we learn about the relationships between, we talked earlier about the relationships between the parts of the Trinity, the God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and how they relate to one another internally, and then how we fit into that scheme, so, and how we relate to it. So that's a real deep and difficult section of this book. It's one that I've been both dreading and anticipating, if that makes sense. It's going to be hard, but I know there will be tremendous reward for us as we work our way through it. So next week we'll finish chapter 13, and we'll probably get an introduction into chapter 14, 15, and 16. So that'll be our goal for next week. Thanks, everybody, for coming. God is good.